I mean, first on the list, we get all kinds of questions about insurance. We know insurance after Ian has definitely, been a struggle. It's just very different. Flood zones specifically. I encountered an issue just this week where FEMA has come in. They have changed the maps around, some homes that used to not be in a flood zone now are in a flood zone. Specifically, a house can be in an X flood zone. The house itself, however, all of the surrounding areas can now be in an 8E. So in that situation, just because that house is elevated and in that X and all the other surrounding areas are not, that is going to, make you have to buy flood insurance if you're getting a loan. That's only if you're getting a loan. If you are a cash buyer, that changes the whole scenario. You can pick and choose. Do I want flood insurance? Do I want the risk? Do I not want the risk? The house may have flooded. It may have not flooded. I mean, that is a personal preference. But if you are getting a loan, you are then required to get flood insurance to close that.
Yeah, the maps are really interesting. I try to tell people because they're like, oh, I don't want to be in an area where it floods. So I'm like, well, let me just zoom in on this map for you. And it's like squiggly lines. Like she said, like, I could be in a flood zone and she's right next door and she's not. And you see these like squiggly lines. But what happens is when the flood insurance, are looking at it, they're seeing, okay, part of your property is, or this whole area is. So you really have to see if you can get an exemption. I had one where the house was built up so tall, had never flooded at all, nothing. And almost like 90% of the house wasn't in the flood zone, but just like a little slither of the actual lot was, and they required it.
They do, but expanding a little bit more on that, in this particular situation, your driveway maybe is in the flood zone, but the house isn't. The pool might be in the flood zone, but the house isn't. You can handle this yourself. There is a way to go through FEMA, ask for an exemption. There are companies, if you're not that hands-on person and don't want to be bothered with that, don't have the time, you can call this third-party company. They can come in and they can let you know, hey, yep, this one should be easy to pull out of that flood zone, or no, it's not going to be easy, give you a cost associated with that and handle it typically in much less time than it would take you to do it yourself.
Absolutely. They know exactly what they're looking at and they've done it before. So like, even though it's possible to do it yourself for less money, it's like, do you know all the ins and outs and do you have the time to wait for that?
Right.
Another thing I just want to mention too is like when you are shopping insurance, it's really important to think about like where you are and what risks are associated with this area. Obviously hurricanes, so our wind insurance, I would suggest, like, are very important. Flood's important. If you look at a map and you see Cape Coral and you see all the water, all the canals, almost anywhere you kind of would be better off to have it. And the really cool thing is like if you're not in the highest flood zone or you're out of a flood zone, your flood insurance policy would be really inexpensive.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead and get it. And then like one insurance, broker that we use a lot had mentioned, she did that on her personal home. She wasn't in a flood zone. And then they remapped and she was.
Right.
But luckily, like her policy was so inexpensive, she went to get a new one. It could have been like 2, 3, 4 times the amount.
And even expanding on that a little bit, if this particular house has had a flood policy for 20 years, never been flooded, and they're paying, $800 a year, most of the time you can assume that flood policy at that current amount. Most of the time, not all the time, of course, but most of the time. So that is super helpful. That's always something to think about. And even beyond that, we're all conditioned, no matter where you live. We're from the Midwest. Hurricanes was a thing, or not hurricanes, tornadoes,
Right.
But until it, physically affects you, it's kind of like, oh, geez, there's a tornado down the road, or, oh, geez, there's a hurricane, or, oh, geez. But until it actually affects you, that's when it becomes personal. So definitely, look at that, make that choice, really research if that's something, flood insurance, no flood insurance, hurricane insurance, wind insurance, all of those things. It's super specific to your needs.
Right. And that's, like I said earlier, if you're, a cash buyer, you can decide if you want all of it, none of it, or any combination in between. So I recently had some customers that, were paying cash and they had looked at the home and they're like, they knew what happened to the home when Ian, and now it has a new roof and the pool cage was fine and all these things. So they declined their wind insurance, which I was like, okay, that's a risk. But also when you look at it over the years, we may not have something major like that where they need it, or they might not even meet the deductible because the deductibles are kind of high too. So in their mind, it was worth the risk. But again, if you're getting a loan, that lender is going to say, nope, you have to have all of these things.
Absolutely. And so, we were in a position after Ian to where, a lot of those insurance companies left. Now, a couple years later, we have a lot more choices. The rates are much more competitive than they were. So, don't let this freak you out at all. Like, come down here, take a look at the house. You love the house. You call, our insurance people, we get you quotes. And if it's something, that makes sense to you, let's do it. Just don't just assume because you're in a flood zone that absolutely means that you are going to get flooded, because that is not the case. It's always a risk. Anywhere in the country where you live, there's a risk of some type of disaster.
Well, and I mean, the last few years, especially, turn on the news at any given time and there's some kind of natural disaster going on somewhere, I feel like.
Yeah. And I mean, California going through what they're dealing with right now. I mean, what does that look like nationwide for insurance? No one knows yet. So it's just one of those wait and see games. But I mean, in addition to, talking about flood zones and things like that, I mean, there are other insurance inspections, when you're getting a loan or when you're not getting a loan that you may want, that you really need to think about. I mean, you've got your wind mitigation inspections in addition to your regular home inspection and your 4-point inspections. Right. And certainly, I mean, we've, been rounds and rounds with some of these homes that we sell that, it did. The water heater's 10 years old. Well, guess what? Insurance doesn't love that. So, whether you're a seller or you're a buyer, I mean, these are things that you need to think of pre-listing. Let's talk about, maybe we do a home inspection. Maybe we get that 4-point in wind mid because, they're only good for, a certain amount of time. And so these are all things that help, as a seller, your buyers, decide very quickly whether they can get insurance, it's affordable, it's something that they want to take on or not. But these are all super, super important things that you need to think about.
Yeah, I would say that also because this area is, for many, many years, I mean, pretty much the whole time I've been licensed, we've been more of like an as-is kind of scenario because we have a lot of investors here, a lot of cash and stuff. And you can sell a house in any condition. You can sell a house burned out, full of mold, like anything. There's nothing in some areas. People come here and they're like, well, it has to meet these things in order to sell, right? And I'm like, no, it doesn't. No. But having someone like, one of us that's experienced and been through these things, we can look at a house and tell you, okay, there's a flat roof. That's going to be a problem. Or, hey, look, the HVAC is this old. That's going to be a problem. The roof's this old. That's going to be a potential problem. And you can either avoid that property, as a buyer, or we can come in and put in the offer, hey, look, we want this, but we want a credit, or we want this fixed, or, whatever that looks like. So it doesn't mean that that house has to be off the table. The other thing that I wanted to mention with insurance too is because up north, you have kind of nationwide insurance carriers and these names that you're used to. And a lot of them haven't been in Florida for years and years and years. So people come here and they're like, oh, I called my insurance company and they said they don't even write in Florida. And then that immediately scares you to think there's no insurance in Florida. And I know that some of the news has even kind of made it seem like, oh, they can't no one can get insurance. Those are very rare scenarios where you cannot get insurance. And there are a lot of options. Like Sarah said, last couple of years, we've had so many new companies open and, have these policies, and they're pretty affordable. I mean, I saved switching to a newer one myself.
Same. And I mean, that's just something living in Florida that we do. I mean, just because you're with XYZ company this year doesn't mean that you're not going to shop for a new insurance company next year. The rates, might be better, the coverage better. It depends on the year itself. I mean, things change so quickly and so fast, around here with that. So definitely something to always shop around for. But, going back to, the 4-point and, as a seller with the inventory levels that we have today, I mean, you really have to think of all of these things that put your house ahead of, maybe the other houses, that these buyers are looking at, and having, a pre-inspection done, having all of your 4-point and wind mitt ready and, up to date. That's going to help a buyer, take all of that information information, get their quotes, avoiding time, delays, heartache because all of a sudden, they get to their home inspection and their contingent, their home inspection contingency, and they're like, I saw insurance and it's, whatever it is, and I can't afford that. Well, the last thing that we want is a deal to fall apart. Nobody wants that. The seller doesn't want it. The buyer doesn't want it. We all want to make it work. And really our job as agents is to problem solve. There's always a solution to every problem. 100%.
And I feel like that comes with experience because you don't know something until you've gone through it.
Right.
Because even, like we hear from each other, oh, this is happening. So now then we can kind of say, okay, this is a new thing to look out for. But if you haven't gone through it, you're a brand new agent or you're working with a brand new agent and they just, maybe they're not on a team or has a broker who's paying attention, training them, they're not going to know. You could literally get to that 11th hour and the deal just fall apart.
Yes, we all know. And it happens and it stinks. And, it's just heartbreaking for everyone involved. It really is. So, it's so important to call, an agent that has been through this. I mean, combined together, how much time do we have? 30 years? 30?
No, that's aging us. We're not that old.
But, walking into a house with a buyer and I'm, already scanning, oh, the wet area doesn't have a GFCI. Well, that's going to be an issue. Or, oh gosh, it's this kind of, electrical box. We know that, they say it causes challenges that, it'll cause a fire. So insurance, your rates are either going to be sky high or they're going to just tell you, no thanks.
The polybutylene plumbing.
Copper plumbing. Yes.
Could have issues. And to know the years, because a lot of people don't know, there's certain years that they were building the home. So if you see that the house was built or remodeled during those years, we better go get under there and look.
Right. No. So, it just goes back down to experience and actually living through the process and doing this hundreds of times, and we really just have to keep up on it because if insurance says no to this day, next week it might be different, so you just never know. You really never know.
They're looking at their risk. We don't want you to be scared though, because sometimes a home inspector, their job is to come in and tell you all the things that are wrong. And that's what we want them to do. But sometimes they can seem really scary, especially if you're not from this area or used to these types of houses. Certain things are different in Florida than they would be in Michigan or Ohio or wherever you're coming from. And so you hear something, you're like, oh, this wood rot and is the whole house falling down? And you were like, no, that's normal. It's very humid here. That can be fixed by X, Y, and Z. We get a contractor to look at it for you. But sometimes when you read something, especially if you weren't there for the home inspection, which you don't need to be, but if you just receive this report, some of those things can look really scary. So even though we say we're going to look out for certain things, the home inspector is going to find things, and it's important to have an agent that again can say, okay, here's what this means, or here's somebody else we can bring in to evaluate what this means, versus oh, this house needs so much, we got to move on.
Right. And a typical home inspection report, with pictures and, descriptions, all that, they can be 80 pages long. That's pretty typical, I would say.
Yeah.
But we always suggest, if it's possible, come to the home inspection. Meet the inspector there so you can walk with him, talk with him or her, in real time. This is a big deal or this isn't a big deal. And this is, possibly what it would cost, or this is who needs to come look at it. And again, a home inspector knows a lot about, all of the things. You have a seawall problem as an example. We're not going to depend on the home inspector to tell us what's wrong with that seawall. We're going to call in a seawall guy. He's going to come over here. He's going to take a look at it. He's going to tell us what it costs, all of the things that we need to know at that point. And then again, you make that decision, whether it's something you want to take on or something, that maybe just doesn't make sense to you at that time.
Yeah. And that's totally the thing, because just because there's something wrong with the house doesn't mean that you probably might not still want it. We could potentially try to renegotiate something, or, you're just like, okay, I'll get to that. I know that's something that's going to be in the future. We've sold so many homes where they knew that they had repairs once they got in, they were going to have to take care of, but they were okay with that. It was on the report. They were made aware of it. Right. And they're like, yeah, for the price, I'm fine with this.
Exactly.
So, even some of these, new construction homes, we bring home inspectors to those and they find things and you would think, okay, new construction, everything should be perfect.
Right.
But they're not. Oh,
Sometimes new construction are the biggest offenders, honestly. I mean, you walk in there and you see the blue tape and the punch out and, all of these things, but yet they forgot to do XYZ. I mean, they're all human. I mean, the city's human, the builders are human. I mean, mistakes can be made, but it is super important. I mean, regardless of whether they offer some fantastic, warranty or not. I mean, as you know, with anything in life, I mean, that company might be here today and gone tomorrow. So you want to know what you're dealing with that moment before you sign on that line.
absolutely. Absolutely.